This webinar is co-financed by the European Union Programme of Employment and Social Innovation called EASY. The bootcamp is also supported by our partners and members like BCRS, Crystal, BFC and OpenCBS. This organization is delivering today's webinar for us. Let me just say that today we are explaining concepts that are widely used but maybe not necessarily very clear. We are going to talk about open APIs, open banking, and open architecture. So we are going to touch upon basics, explaining what is it, how it can be used by MFIs, and hopefully by the end of this webinar you will have a better understanding and you will be able to talk really with your IT departments, with IT contractors, thinking about new innovative solutions, especially in these weird times of coronavirus where we need more innovation. Let me also welcome Alexis Lebel, who is a CEO of OpenCBS. Good morning, Alexis. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everyone.
So Alexis has experience of work actually inside of microfinance institution in Afghanistan. He also has experience of working in microfinance as consultant in countries like Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and also other countries outside ICA region. His career led him to set up this company that develops API-based solution to financial institutions, including microfinance institutions. Alexis, I believe you will say a few more words about yourself and the company in your presentation. Meantime, let's just see what are your expectations towards coronavirus. I can see that, I hope you can see the results on your screen. I can see that definitely majority of us gathered today here in this webinar says that we will stay home until end of May, and more than actually 25% of us is even more pessimistic that it will take much longer. Let's see how it goes. Let me just say that very soon, actually this Thursday, MFC is launching the first webinar in the series of webinars devoted to coping with this coronavirus crisis. So we are going to discuss how different institutions from our sector deal with this, both including the perspective of clients and employees. So feel free to check our webpage for the registration link. I really invite you to join the webinar. Also, let me just take this opportunity to say that next Tuesday we are having an interesting webinar continuing the series of digitalization about customer digital behavior. So what are the trends, how people behave online, and how financial institutions can make use of this knowledge. So feel invited to join the live online. And Alexis, now the time is yours. For the next 50 minutes or more, we will hear this quite technical but also basic presentation about open APIs. So since for many of us it might be quite a new thing, so I really would like to encourage you to to ask questions as we go. You can type them into the chat box, or simply unmute yourself and ask questions. I think it will be really beneficial if we can share the questions and comments, as that's quite a technical topic, as I said. Alexis, back now. The time is yours, and if you can share your presentation and walk us through the topic.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar in those difficult times. I just wanted to walk you first through the outline. So I'll just present OpenCBS first and explain why we actually are quite knowledgeable about APIs, because we deal with them every day. Then I'll try to be not too technical, but explain about API basics and how it works. And as Eva just said, you are welcome to interrupt. We'll also have a few examples of open banking and also review some legal aspects that are linked to APIs before concluding about open architecture and open source in general. So I'll try to be very simple, but again, please do interrupt me. Why it's interesting to first present OpenCBS? Well, we are trying to develop solutions around financial inclusion. We are about 7-8 years old. We were founded in 2013. We are employing 21 people, mostly in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, which is one of the MFC countries where we have all our developers actually. And our business model is around charging very reasonable upfront and subscription cost for our solutions. And we try, depending on the local context and regulations, to offer our solutions as software as a service. So you rent our solutions, but you don't pay too much initially. Why we are into APIs? Mostly because we develop solutions that are using APIs. The main one is OpenCBS Cloud. It's a core banking system. You all have core banking systems if you are representing MFIs to run your institutions. And OpenCBS Cloud is running with APIs. It has also very open architecture that I'll mention a little bit later. And we also offer two other products. One is a digital field application, tablet application, and a loan origination solution, which can also work with other systems like third-party core banking systems by API. So now that doesn't tell me what is the API about. We have clients pretty much in quite a few countries, mostly in Africa, as you can see, not that much in MFC countries, but both mostly our clients and our prospects approach us because they are looking for affordable solutions for microfinance. So about API basics. So I think it's important to explain what an API is and why it can be useful for microfinance institutions or financial institutions in general. So I thought it was, before explaining what it is, to explain the use of it, because that's what for you is important, right? So typically, I'm not sure if some of you are using this already, it could be the case, but it's very much used for payments. For instance, if you want to disburse or repay your loans using mobile money, typically your core banking system will be connected by API to the systems of the mobile money provider. You could also use it for doing direct operations for deposits and withdrawing, right? If you use an agent, for instance, it could be that there is a system in between which connects to your core banking system to perform the operations. It's very common for loan assessment. For instance, credit bureaus, sometimes you have an interface with the credit bureau, which is using APIs. Sometimes it's more like, I would say, an old system where you upload a file at the end of the month. It's also used for credit scoring, especially if you use data points that are outside, I would say, the data that you have within your own systems, or for checking anti-money laundering blacklists. For instance, you may know LexisNexis or systems like that, which can be used for verifying that the client is not on a blacklist before taking him as a customer. And finally, I'll move to the next slide, it could be used for what we call digital field application. You take the loan application on a third-party system, for instance, tablet application, and after you have collected all the information related to appraisal, taken pictures of the client, you can transmit this information to your core banking system. So maybe it would be interesting. It will also help me to know about how to present and to introduce, I would say, the presentation. It would be interesting to know who among the participants in this webinar think they make use of APIs already and think their APIs are used to share information between systems. So you may know and have them, you may know you don't have them, or you may don't really know how it's working because you are not so much into the technical aspects of your MFIs.
So I've just launched the poll, and thank you for voting. We have already almost 60% of participants of this webinar voted. We are, okay, let's just have a few more seconds to allow everyone to vote. So, right.
Well, it looks like it's pretty shared, right? Some people are sure they are not using, some people are using for sure, but most people are knowledgeable about APIs already. So I'm just wondering why I'm speaking today. I'll try to give practical examples then.
Let me just end the polling, because Alexis, that's what only you can see. So let me just end this option and share the results. So now everyone should see that indeed, it's 50-50. Some people say that their MFIs use the APIs, and actually equal number says that they don't. So, so we might, I would like to encourage those of you who have experience here just to share your examples as we go. Okay.
Okay, so I'll continue on the presentation, and feel free to interrupt to share your own experience when you like. So I start with a very simple definition because it's important to define what we are speaking about, right? So an API, to put it very simply, is a codified method of communication between different information systems. So usually you have a need for authentication and security as well, especially if those systems are not working together in the same environment. And there are many standards for APIs, depending on industry, depending on purpose. You have different ways of codifying this method of communication. The one which is the most common for what we call web services, which means all systems which can be accessed from a browser, like when you use Chrome and when you use whatever browser to access the system, are what we call REST APIs, which are quite codified. And APIs are basically covering most of the actions that the system can do. For instance, in your case, if you use a core banking system, register a client, create a loan. And the way a lot of modern systems are set up is that what we call the back end, which is in a core banking system, the system which calculates all accruals, which calculates all interest, for instance, the main core of the system is communicating with what you see, the front end, which is what you see on your browser, by API. So that's the case, for instance, in OpenCBS, and the case for most web-based core banking systems. Also, it's possible for these systems to communicate with third parties, with other systems by API, but of course, in that case, an authentication is required. If I go a little bit into details about how it works, you see it looks technical, but it's very simple, and I'll explain it. You have different standard API functions for those web services, REST APIs, and you can see the colors, it's quite codified, and you can see the words, right? You have some standard function. For instance, get is very simple. If I want to retrieve information from a system, I use the function get. If I want, on the contrary, to create a new record, for instance, here you can see collateral controller, right? So it's the system in OpenCBS which manages collateral. If I want to create a new collateral associated to a loan application, I use the function post. If I want, on the contrary, to update an existing collateral linked to a loan application, I use a function put. Put is used to update record and delete, as you know, as you can guess, to delete a record. So you also have a function patch, which is more if you want to update partially. For instance, if you want to change the value of a collateral, you may use a function patch. So you see those functions are codified. And if I go back a few years in history, it's quite new. I mean, it's not very new, but it's like 20, and Web API is like 10, 15 years that we have this codified system for systems to work together. It's very interesting in terms of use because it's future-proof. It means that if I change the system and if I upgrade my systems in general, the APIs will remain, or there will be minor update to do to the APIs for them to keep working. So it's interesting because it's kind of flexible and usually quite cheap also to implement. Suppose that I've tried to create a collateral link to a loan application, for instance, by API. For instance, using my tablet application, or for instance, using, I don't know, another mobile app, I also get some standard responses. For instance, if I've been successful adding my collateral, I will get OK, 200, right? If there was, for instance, I tried to delete a collateral record, but there was nothing to delete, I will get 204, there was no content. Or if I'm not authorized, I may get 401. It means I'm authenticated. I'm allowed to use this API in general, but I don't have the specific rights to do this, unauthorized. Or 403 forbidden, it means I'm not even authorized to use this system, so I get a negative response. So this is, you see, a way of using APIs. And of course, to know how to use them, APIs need to be documented. So I've taken here an example of another cloud-based core banking system, Mambu. And you can see that they have very much documented everything on their APIs. If I want, for instance, to work with clients, for instance, or to get my clients by ID, which is, you can see, get client by ID, by getting my clients by ID, I can make a request and I can get this information from the core banking system. And you also have in the documentation some examples of code. So all APIs that are basically what we call external facing. So I'll explain just now what it is, needs to be documented. What is authentication? APIs, basically, you have internal APIs. For instance, in OpenCBS, we have those internal APIs for the front end, what you see communicating to the back end. Those are internal, so they are not necessarily accessed by third parties. For instance, if I create a loan product in OpenCBS, it's very unlikely any other third-party system will want to create a loan product, right? So we don't have any API to create a loan product. But most common things, for instance, creating a profile, creating a loan application, disbursing a loan, maybe interacting with other systems. And for those things, for those actions, you need to have external facing APIs. It means some APIs that you decide to share with others and that you expose to other third-party systems. And because you expose them, that's the vocabulary we use, you have to secure them because you don't want anyone, of course, to be able to access those systems. You don't want anyone to create a new client record in your database. You don't want anyone to disburse a loan without authorization. There are different protocols for securing. The main one we use is OAuth 2, which is a protocol developed by Google, but there are different of them. And of course, if you give access to a third party to use your APIs, you are supposed to be able to revoke access at some point. It's very important that the third party which is using the API is trusted. Sometimes we'll speak about it about PSD2 in Europe, it's because you have regulations and those third parties have a license, which makes them, I would say, by definition, a bit trusted because you know they have to apply for a license and they are kind of proofed before getting a license. Or sometimes it's more an agreement between two parties. For instance, you as an MFI agree that your core banking system will be accessed by OpenCBS tablet application. And for this, it would be useful to have a contract to make sure we don't abuse of this situation, this opportunity, sorry.
Alexis, let me stop you for a second. So far, what I understand is that if I'm an MFI and I want to communicate between two different systems, be it both are my internal systems or one is external one, I need the API to communicate. The question is, can I, like, do I need, I understand that all those codes and comments that you showed us, that I need somebody who has the program, who is a developer, who has this knowledge to program so that we can, the API can be created, correct?
Correct. And you need a programmer. Usually you will use an IT company, right? And typically this IT company has developed a solution. For instance, in our example before, digital field application, right? I want to take a loan application and then send it to the core banking system. And of course, my role as an MFI will be to verify that, that partner that I want to onboard to take my loan applications as all the authorization is trusted enough for me to use it. I don't want to give access to my core banking system before I'm kind of comfortable about it. And therefore, besides, I would say, me being comfortable, there is also this authorization system so that the APIs, access to the API cannot be done by anyone.
Okay, let me check if there are any other questions.
Sure.
Before we go further. Are there any questions about these basics of the APIs? And really feel free to ask them, as we need really clarification on those technical issues. So feel free to unmute yourself or to type in your question in the chat box. But so far, sounds like everything is clear. So, Alexis,
okay,
please.
Let me conclude about the technical part of the APIs. So when we speak about open APIs, for sure you've heard about this before, right? Because it's kind of fashionable and it's kind of also coming into force. It has come into force recently in the EU. It doesn't mean that everyone can access indeed. It means that, of course, if you are authorized to do this action, you can access those APIs, and that all those APIs that third parties can access are documented. One point is that when I speak about MFIs and APIs, it's not like yourself as an MFI, you have to develop your own APIs, right? It's usually the systems you are using, the providers you are using are going to develop those APIs for you. And if you have a question about how can I expose my APIs for whoever to do this, you need to talk to your core banking system provider or potentially other systems providers. And depending on the frameworks, actually, I will discuss about the framework, and I go to PSD2. Depending on the framework, sometimes some countries impose that banks and financial institutions share information by APIs to third parties, and sometimes it's more based on being willing to do so. So some banks decide by choice to sometimes share information by API. So let's speak about open banking and how it's relevant to API use. It's just a specific. Yes.
Okay, that's I managed this, so I need to mute.
No problem. So regarding open banking, it's one specific case of API use. As I said, most systems are connected by APIs anyway, but by open banking, it's a way that usually regulators have imagined to force banks, especially, to share information with third parties. What we noticed is that banks usually add a lot of very interesting information, for instance, customer information, for instance, all cash flows of clients who have accounts with them, right? And also all the personal information related to payments. So it would be interesting if mostly banks, but sometimes other financial institutions, could share this data with third-party providers. It would result in improved competition, right? If we all have access to the cash flows of the client on the bank account, it's easier to make an assessment of the repayment capacity for a loan. And also, the regulators thought that it was also a good way to improve services for end customers. There are different open banking models. I won't go into the details here, but if you want, you can go to this open bank project to get more information. Depending on markets, depending on countries, you have different standards. I'll probably focus on the European Union because it's where some of you are based right now, and you've all heard about the Payment Service Directive 2, which came into force very recently, and which aimed at allowing third parties, fintech companies especially, to propose new products and to some extent compete with banks. So there are two main applications of PSD2 in the European Union. One of them is payments. In order to be able to actually propose payments to customers, you need to be certified, of course, as a payment initiation service provider. And the idea was to propose more options and to make payments cheaper. Most clients were depending on Visa, your MasterCard networks, and the banks to do their transactions. And by opening the bank's APIs to payment providers, the idea was to have more competition in the payment industry. The other one is account information. It's very relevant to credit. It forces banks and financial regulated providers in general to share information about customers and their transactions, as long as those customers agree, of course, with third-party providers. And it enables, of course, new applications to credit, especially if you can extract information from those banks about clients. You can, of course, make a more informed credit decision, for instance. The EU requires what we call strong customer authentication. It means at least two of the following systems must be used for authenticating the client. One of them is knowledge. So it's very simple. Knowledge is something you have and only you know, for instance, or usually only you know, for instance, your password of access to the internet banking. Ownership, for instance, a mobile device. This is the second option. For instance, typically it's what we call OTP, one-time password. You receive on your mobile a password for one-time transaction to allow access. And the last one, which is less used right now, is what we call inherence, something which is specific to you as a person, your fingerprint, your eye scan, etc. So for payments, especially, you must use at least two of those options for authenticating the client and for letting the transaction proceed.
Let me just say that these are, thank you for touching upon PSD2, and let me just say as an information for our participants that we have a separate webinar focused only on PSD2 in Europe, so you can check out our webpage for Digital Literacy Bootcamp to see to watch this webinar devoted fully to PSD2 only.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think it would be very interesting for those who have not watched those webinars yet. I wanted to share three examples of open banking applications. One of them is very simple. It's accounting. You may know I'm from France myself, and actually SME accounting is extremely complex because there are many regulations to comply with, not only open banking, but just more in terms of the regulations on reporting, social contributions, etc. So most French SMEs outsource their accounts to an accountant or an accounting company. And if you can see my example here, it's in French, but it's not, I will explain what it is. It allows basically to make the accounting more automated, especially for the accounting company, which is making the accounting for those SMEs, by pulling out directly the information from the account statement of the client. You know that most SMEs in Europe, they are quite digitized. I mean, at least they use a bank account. So it's possible most of their transactions go by bank. A few transactions may go by check and a few other ones by cash. But basically, when you do the accounting, 80% is about the bank statement. So PSD2 allows, for instance, an accounting company in France to directly pull out, scrape the information for the bank account. And as you can see on my examples here, most transactions from the bank account are typically already automatically affected to accounting accounts by the system, and only what is not clear, for instance, a check here, you can see on my line, on line 3, have to be allocated manually. So it saved a lot of time to accounting companies to have the system in place, which allows taking automatically information from the bank statement. Another example of application is, you may have it in some of your countries, is what we call account integration. As a customer, for instance, it's interesting for me to see all my different accounts in one single interface, no matter if I'm a person or a company, an SME. And you can see here an example of open banking in the UK, but it's similar in the European Union, whereby in my internet banking, HSBC UK, I can give some API access to third-party providers, for instance, an account aggregator. And you can see on the right of the screen that I've been able to have all my accounts aggregated in one place. I can give HSBC the right to pull information from other banks, or I can give a third-party mobile app, for instance, access to pull my account information from different banks here in the UK. So it's also an interesting application. It's also quite useful for persons of SME to have all this information in one place. Another example is customer authentication, what we call eKYC, the know your customer. And when you want to onboard a client as an MFI or a bank, you have usually complicated regulations to comply with, right? Could be getting a proof of address, could be also verifying the ID of the person. So ID Now is a German company which allows to do account opening digitally, but without having the client to, for instance, visit a branch or do any physical interaction with the financial service provider. So for most account openings which are simple, it's just possible to scan your ID using their application and then take a selfie of yourself using the app, which verifies that the picture is matching. And then based on this, you can open the account. So they have contracts with most of the banks in Germany and with most of the financial institutions in Germany, including digital banks. And for more traditional banks, which are sometimes subject to more even constraining regulation, you have to scan your ID and then you have to have a video session with an agent, which is checking basically that you are, again, the same person as the person applying for the account. This is required, I don't know why in Germany for banks, it's a bit more complex, and therefore they have adapted their different products to what regulations are requiring. And how it works, of course, is because there is an API integration, since we are talking about API, between, for instance, the mobile app of, let's say, Commerzbank, on which you open a bank account, and this ID Now system. So this is a third example. Maybe at some point it would be interesting if some MFIs or participants want to share their experience. You may have more interesting experience to share with us.
Yeah, maybe Alexis, maybe that's indeed a very good moment to ask our participants, those of you who mentioned that your institution use APIs. It would be really great to hear from you right now. How do you use API? If anyone would like to share your experience or what you know about this, it's a perfect timing. So let me check if anyone is wishing to unmute and share your experience. We know that at least 10 people voted that they use APIs. I understand that we might not have the clear, complete knowledge about how this is used in your MFI, but if anyone would like to share a few words, you're more than welcome to do it now. Meantime, Alexis, let me just comment, because especially this last example, that's also it addresses one of the typical complaints of clients, that they need to submit so many documents to the branch before signing the contract. So potentially that's a way, using such applications and APIs that are built in, I understand that you can transmit or translate the information scanned by the client directly into your core MIS. So that having such a solution would be less work for loan officers and less trouble for clients, correct?
Right. I guess you are speaking to me, right? But yes, definitely. So it's very interesting. And depending on the situation, I can give another example. For instance, that's assuming that, of course, the client is knowledgeable and knows IT and can do everything by himself or herself, right? The prospect. But another alternative that we use, for instance, in Africa is to use a tablet application where the loan officers are visiting the client and taking all the information with this tablet application, the address, taking pictures of the business location, the home, taking pictures of ID documents, taking picture of proof of address, and they use the tablet application to, together with the client or with the prospect, open the account. So the alternative way, if the client, if the people are not knowledgeable enough to use directly those tools, is to equip your loan officers with, for instance, devices that may not completely help you to automate fully the account opening process or the loan application process, but at least make it more efficient, faster, and a bit cheaper for you.
Okay. Okay. So once again, I encourage those of you who have experience in APIs to share your experience, but I see no one is unmuting themselves. So let's continue.
Yeah, maybe I can speak about the legal aspects, because using APIs, you can see it's great because, yeah, you can transfer information in what seems to be a seamless way, right? But at the same time, it carries a lot of risk, right? And it's very important to think also, as I'm speaking here mostly to MFIs, but also to potentially funds or anyone who is dealing with customer data. It's very important to make sure that, yes, you have a view of your APIs, or at least the APIs that your systems are using, because there are risks associated. So it's very important as an MFI or as a financial institution to, I would say, have this under your radar so that you can understand what could happen through those APIs. And when you want to share data, so you have to decide, yes, before sharing data by APIs with a third party, you want to make sure, as I said, that this third party is trusted. If you're in Europe, you can be kind of feeling a bit safe because you can say, okay, if that third party is already licensed and if it has, for instance, a payment initiation service provider license, it's already probably quite safe, and it's true. But in many countries, there is absolutely no legal framework in place. So it means the work of reviewing the credibility of the third parties who have access to your information by API is very important. It's your work as an MFI. So it's important that when you know that two systems are communicating together by API, yourself, you kind of assess the partner, especially the smaller companies. Usually the core banking systems providers, most of the time they are quite big. Usually they have a reputation already, but mostly the user of the APIs, what we call in legal term the API consumer, you have to make sure that this third party, which is pulling information or pushing information by API, is safe to work with. You may want to check if they are financially sound. You may want to check that they have the capacity to do anti-money laundering checks on for instance, any clients that are onboarded via those systems. You may want to take a look at the security measures they have in place, maybe disaster recovery or business continuity plans. And you want to make sure that those third parties you are sharing data with, they are not sharing data again with other third parties that you have no idea and no control about. It's very important, right? Because you are dealing as an MFI with customer data. So there are some risks, and it's very important that you keep an eye on those risks.
So Alexis, who should be responsible in MFI for conducting such due diligence of the third party? Is there any specific position that should be responsible for this, or how does it look like usually in MFIs? It
would be at the crossroad between IT and legal probably, but at the same time you need to know the business processes involved, right? So I think it's probably better to have a small team, including people working with credit or savings if you are taking deposits, but IT and legal would be the most likely people. And of course, your IT providers have already some contract in place and some framework themselves, but it's important to take a look at them and not to blindly trust, I would say, those providers, because you don't know actually what they do behind your back, and it's important to verify what is being done. So, and again, I'm speaking here mostly about non-regulated environment, meaning most countries that are not under those open banking legal frameworks. For how long? So usually you would also look that there is a term upon which this access can be revoked. It could be, for instance, if you have already a contract with your IT providers upon revocation or end of the contract, but it's not always clear. So you have to check this. And finally, You may also want to make sure rights are revoked upon the realization of certain events. For instance, insolvency of the third party, the PSD license, PSD2 license being withdrawn, if the company which is using APIs is bought by another company, if there is a case of security breach and data leak, for instance, you want to make sure you can revoke those access. And finally, your own clients, right, your own customers, usually will need to be informed that their data may be shared or accessed by API. So it means, or in the loan contract, if you are an MFI, or maybe in some general conditions that you are sharing on your website or with clients, you may also want to make sure that end clients are informed. For instance, if you are using information, a scoring system for analyzing the repayment capacity, or if you're using the credit bureau, typically, and even before APIs were invented, you have to have consent somewhere, and you have to tick something that I approve that this MFI is interrogating this credit bureau for accessing my information. So you have to review any kind of information shared by API. Is it something that is, should be linked to a contract, and is it something that should also require end client consent? It's very important, and it would also probably be required by the regulations of your country, so you have to check this. When you are acquiring a new software, actually, well, I think it's to be a bit more practical. So yeah, it's important to know if the system has APIs. If it doesn't have, well, it's kind of clear, right? There is no, it would be a case-to-case integration. But if it has, well, you have to make sure that you review a little bit further what are those APIs that are exposed, especially the ones that are externally accessible. It's also important for you as an MFI. Suppose that I acquire a new core banking system and I know that it has APIs. Good. But it may be that if I want to interface with another system for, let's say, credit scoring, I have to pay additional fees for API access. So it's important when you negotiate your contract that you understand which APIs are accessible for sharing information, but also if, for instance, the core banking system provider is charging you for API access, because it may, of course, change completely the costs, right, over 5 years if you plan to do a lot of data sharing and data integration with other systems. You also have to access the risk of data leak to third parties that I've mentioned, and also think about, again, should I contract? Should I have a contract for those APIs? Just to give an example, we are working with a large MFI in Jordan, for instance, OpenCBS, to interface their core banking system with our tablet application, which is used for digital field application for loans. And at the time we signed the contract, yes, they said, yes, we have APIs, we are sharing, they shared some of the APIs with us, and we realized actually that during the process that they were very partial APIs, not covering everything we wanted to do with that tablet application, despite what we were told initially. And now that core banking system provider is trying to charge our client in Jordan more money for developing APIs that are missing, when the APIs should have been there initially when the software was provided, the core banking software was provided to them. So it's very important that when you think of a new system, especially core banking system, you think at the same time of potential integrations with third-party systems. Is it going to be costly? Is it technically possible? And again, is it safe? And what kind of legal framework should I put around this?
So again, in such a case, that's responsibility of IT department to assess such possible adaptations with other systems.
Correct. But if you look at, for instance, acquiring a new CBS, your core banking system, you would think that you have, of course, involvement from legal, but also the CEO. And I think in that case, before signing any contract, of course, with the system provider, it's very important that you have, yes, review by legal, review by the business team, and the CEO also is usually involved in those kind of things because, of course, it's a big decision. It's very important, and it's good to think about all the consequences of acquiring a new system.
Okay, thank you. Again, like if you have any questions, because I'm aware it might be, not all of us might be familiar with those issues, so feel free to ask questions, either unmuting yourself or typing into the chat box. Alexis.
Yeah.
We can continue.
Okay, I continue then. A few words. So the main points we wanted to share today is about APIs, right? Because we thought it was very, very important that you understand what are the opportunities, but also the legal consequences and the legal aspect is open architecture in general. So a system can be considered to be open, actually, if it can communicate with other systems. So usually because it's based on APIs, and can communicate with other systems in a standardized way, and also because APIs are available for integration, and there is no, I would say, limitation of access unless it's justified. For instance, as we said, the third party is not credible or safe enough that we share information with that third party. Usually, it's important that we can see what is inside those systems, if it's qualifying for open architecture. One option is that the code is published. That's, I would say, the most radical option, which is open source, which I will mention in the coming slides. The other one is that at least there is, I would say, a comprehensive documentation about how the system is functioning. And also it's important to look about the system being future-proof. As I said, APIs are kind of standardized in the way they are described and used. So it's quite useful because it means you don't have to integrate again, for instance, if you are upgrading to a newer version of the software. So it's very important to check if the solution is future-proof and if you can easily keep your integrations with the next version. And if the solution is cloud-based, it comes, I would say, almost automatically together, because then the provider will be responsible for all the upgrades, for pushing them to your environment that you don't even see there is an update, or you just realize there are new functions, but there is no work at all for your IT team to do in terms of upgrade. And in that case, of course, all the APIs will keep functioning as they were before. And you have to check, of course, that and usually an upgrade should be free or inexpensive. Open source. A few words about open source, because this is what we are developing at OpenCBS. The main principle is that the code of the software is free to be inspected, modified, and even redistributed by third parties. Now, there are different types of licenses around open source. I won't go into detail, but the idea sometimes of some open source licenses is that, yes, you can modify, but if you develop improvements, you may need to share back those improvements with the main developer of the open source solution. And there are some licenses that are even quite strict, that if you actually mix things that are open source and not open source in the same program, the open source code may in a way infect the main system, and you may be forced to share back everything to the main developers. So why it can be interesting for MFIs, you may ask me. Why? Well, because it's we use a process of agile development. It's usually guided by a community. Usually open source projects are based on sharing and trying to get the needs of the people using the software. And so it's sometimes interesting because the community can contribute back to the software, and improvements can be shared with all the users of one solution. For instance, at OpenCBS, if we have different clients asking us for the same development, we may try to find a way to accommodate everyone and to share the development costs between those clients. It's also, there are some risks, the main risk being forks. For instance, if two, let's say, competing, I would say, developers are developing the same solutions based on open source tools separately for different clients, you may end up having two different versions of the same software that are afterwards very difficult to reconcile. Because when you start modifying things on one side and the other side, it's very difficult to merge the changes afterwards. So you may have some forks, and sometimes when you see there are many forks, you don't know what to choose anymore. And people also don't know who to contact to implement the software. It's also a risk of lack of structured development and low quality. It's something we have experienced a bit at OpenCBS, with many people actually developing extensions, developing things that they were selling to small clients without our knowledge, because we couldn't control it. And of course, it may have sometimes affected our reputation, that we find out that in Africa, for instance, in this country, there is someone who's been doing a kind of implementation of OpenCBS without our knowledge, and in a way which was not the best way to do. So there are also some risks associated and to take into account for MFIs. it's also the difficulty to establish a model, right? An economic model for open source. Everything cannot be free, and people should see the value about contributing cash or I would say code to the project. And also in some cases, of course, it's always difficult to decide if you want to share with people who could be our competitors. So this was because we made the webinar about open source, open architecture and open APIs. It's a little bit, I would say, a lot of information. If you we will go to questions. If you want to do further reading, I think I have only one document to advise you to read, but it's very, very interesting. It's a CGAP note from like just a few months ago, which explains what kind of legal consideration you should take as an MFI when working with APIs, and which also gives some examples of typical contract that you may want to establish with your system providers in case you don't have a system which is covering a contract, sorry, and a system which is covering all those legal aspects already. So I really encourage you to read this guidance note if you have time.
Okay, thank you, Alexis, very much for recommending this reading. Let me now open up really for questions and comments. And let me start with the question from Massimo. Actually, Massimo, I would really like to encourage you to ask the question yourself, because I think it's a broader questions and would need more clarification. So, so the mic is yours.
Hello,
hello.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Yeah, because yeah. So if you can kind of repeat your questions that you posted in the chat box, and let's. I think it's a bigger discussion. So if you can, yeah, please go ahead. You
want Massimo to speak, or you want me to answer the question, which isn't the?
I'm encouraging Massimo to ask his question directly.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes. As I said, for my limited but average knowledge about open banking, API solutions, regulations, this has emerged as a regional and fragmented initiative from UK and European Union banking sectors. Bringing to different solutions for different environments, for different necessities of banking sectors. This is now bringing a problem because you have European Union and UK that are setting sort of regional standards and regulation, but the other emerging markets countries don't have a regulation. And the problem that every country is trying to build open banking related API built on different protocols. So there is a problem of interoperability among different countries. So it's very difficult to imagine how you can leverage on open banking opportunities in the MFI, in particular in non-European Union context. So I think it's easier now to start to approach open banking for MFI, for microfinance in the European Union environment, only UK environment. It's more difficult, as the expert said, to think about working in emerging markets or African continent, or where the inclusion is a bigger issue because of the absence of a strong regulation of unified protocols. It was my question. What does he think about this? Thanks.
Alexis, actually, you have the experience of working mostly abroad EU, right?
For us as a software provider, it will be much easier. Of course, it was a kind of global standard for open banking. Clearly, there is nothing like that right now. Right now, each country have made their different ways. Some ways are interesting, sometimes less. Sometimes, as we said, there is just no framework at all, which requires, I think, more work from our side and from the side of the MFIs. I think our dream could be that, yes, there is something like IFRS for accounting, right, about open banking and APIs, which set up some kind of global standards. And afterwards, countries could be member or not, or could join or not. And that could be, of course, make our life much easier, and could be also very good, ultimately, for MFIs and customer protection to have global standards in place. But as far as I know, there is no such organization working on global standards right now. There is a project called the Open Banking Project. You can Google it if you want, but it's also partly bank-led, and it's not, I mean, it cannot be like IFRS or anything like that right now. So to have, yes, a kind of global initiative would be excellent and very useful. Thank you, Eva. But we are very far from it, and I don't see it, unfortunately, coming anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do you deal with this as a company that works on daily basis in such environment? How do you deal with the fact that there are no standards and everybody like? I mean, does it impact you, or it's just simply more work because you need to develop things from scratch?
I think not that much, because we do very specific integrations, usually upon the request of a specific clients. We need to, I mean, we have to work mostly on this contractual side, right, where we have to propose in our contracts, I would say, something which is relevant for those integration, and in some cases we have to try to see if it's also suitable for the local regulatory context. But overall, we are a small provider, mostly providing direct integrations of two systems. We don't deal directly with payments ourselves. We work also with different providers for the payments. So I cannot say it's a headache right now, but of course it would be easier for us if there were global standards. But again, I think it's much beyond, I would say, the topic of a webinar, right? We could spend hours discussing it. I think different countries are trying different approaches. Most of them has what we have the concept of regulatory sandbox in place, which is interesting, which is to test a financial innovation, usually often based on APIs. They allow within a certain context, within a related time frame, up to some amount, fintechs to do some trials and to test without having too much impact on the global, I would say, financial sector in that country. It's interesting, but I think we are still in a way, in a stage where the world is experimenting with those concepts of open banking and trying different approaches, and we'll see hopefully in a few years if one approach is, I would say, more suitable than the others. But of course, there are very different stakeholders and interests, I would say, at stake. So we don't know if what will come up as the main standards will be what is most beneficial, I would say, for the end customers.
Mm-hmm. Massimo, how does it answer? How much does it answer your question, or how much does it address your comment?
I completely agree. Just the question I wanted to highlight is that as it's very difficult to measure impact, measure financial inclusion, and to evaluate financial inclusion, and to put together financial metrics with inclusivity metrics will be difficult. It's difficult now to leverage on open banking opportunities in not regulated environments or in transnational frameworks. So it would be easier to start to, it's what I'm trying to do in my research environment, to look at regulated and regional environments to see if it's possible to leverage on platforms banking opportunities for MFI. So it could be difficult now to work in emerging countries for open banking for MFI, because you have problems to define metrics that are standard, to define, to have trusted data, to have uniform data sets. So it could be a bit difficult to build solutions for emerging markets leveraging on open banking platforms.
Okay.
I mean, one word to maybe I mean, at the end, does it make people better? And I think that's always the question, right? It's very difficult to do some kind of randomized controlled trials between, I would say, people who have benefited from open banking environment and some who have not, because different countries have different frameworks, and we are different stage also of financial inclusion in those different countries. But of course, when you look at what is done in Africa, for instance, which is not linked directly to open banking, but mostly when you look at those credit providers who are basically providing you a loan very quickly for a very small sum by using by API, by the way, different kind of customer data. I would say data coming from credit bureaus, but also more social data. It doesn't necessarily make people better off, because when you give a big loan, a small loan to someone at a very high interest rate, by sharing information between different systems, but at the end at an expensive rate, it doesn't necessarily help people to get out of poverty or to be better financially included. So I think, yes, the outcome is always important to monitor, and it's very difficult practically to monitor because of the different stages where countries are in terms of access to financial services.
Yes, thanks. This was
Okay, thank you. So let me check, what are the other questions or comments? Feel free to unmute yourself or to type in your question in the chat box. Meantime, let me just launch a poll measuring your satisfaction with this webinar. So please vote, fill in simply answer the questions about your satisfactions. And still we have few more minutes. So before we really close the webinar, please, yeah, if you have questions, that's the session to ask the question, the moment to ask the questions. I guess, Alexis, anyone who would like to follow up with you on this webinar can also contact you, given the email that you provided on the slide.
Sure. So you have the general contact detail here, but if you want to send me an email personally, just replace contact by Alexis, ALEXIS, @opencbs.com. And of course, I'm always happy to continue the debate or answer questions by email if you are interested to discuss further. And I think, yes, it's also something that MFC and EMN is also working on in general. So hopefully over the coming years, we'll have more interesting information to share about this topic.
Yes, definitely. Definitely, yes. So I think, all right, there is a question. I would, from Emanuela, I would like to know more how you adapted it in South or Central America. Open banking is not yet regulated there. So it's a question about South or Central America.
Yeah, I'm not really able to give any example because unfortunately we have absolutely no client in Central America or South America. We have a few clients in the Caribbean and that's where we stop. But mostly anyway, they are users for CBS without any external integration. So maybe when someone else would like to share information, but what we do again in those type of contexts is just one-to-one integration. We discuss with the MFI what they want, and we discuss with the other IT providers what can be done in terms of integration, and we do a one-to-one integration, which is more difficult for the MFI because yes, they have to review all these legal risks as we've discussed by themselves.
Okay. Anyone again? Anyone who would like to share your experience with using APIs? Because we know some of you mentioned that your MFIs are using APIs, so maybe now it's a good time to hear a bit from your experience. And do we have any volunteers to share some experience? Not really. It sounds like there are also no more questions. So Alexis, with this, I would really like to thank you for contributing, for sharing with us those basics about opening up for us the world of open APIs. So thank you thank you so much for this. Thank you all for participation. As always, I encourage you to visit our webpage to check out upcoming webinars, not only about the bootcamp, but also the upcoming webinar about the coronavirus issue and strategies